They say the statues in the old chapel protect the village, but in the dark, you will realize they aren't guarding the living. They are hungry for them. The town of Oakhaven was quiet, but it was a heavy kind of quiet. It was the type of silence that felt like someone was holding their breath right behind your neck. For Mark, a young man from the city, Oakhaven was just a place on a map until his grandfather passed away. He left Mark a small, ancient house near the edge of the forest. The house was old, made of dark wood and stone, but it wasn't the house that caught Mark's attention. It was the small, private chapel in the backyard. Inside that chapel stood 3 life-sized statues of saints. They were carved from heavy, gray stone. Their faces were beautiful but strange. Their eyes weren't looking up at heaven. They were looking down at the floor, as if they were watching something crawling at their feet. The villagers called them Mga Santo, the Holy Ones. But the villagers never looked at the chapel when they walked by. They crossed themselves and hurried their pace. On his first night, Mark decided to clean the chapel. He was a man of logic. He didn't believe in ghost stories or creepy statues. He took a wet cloth and began to wipe the dust off the first statue. As he cleaned the stone face, he felt something cold. Not stone cold, but ice cold. It felt like touching a frozen piece of meat. He pulled his hand back quickly. "It's just the night air," he whispered to himself. But the silence of the room felt thicker now. He moved to the second statue. This one held a stone book. As Mark wiped the book, he noticed something dark staining the stone pages. It looked like old, dried liquid. He rubbed it hard, and a metallic smell filled the air. It smelled like blood. His heart began to beat faster. Why would there be blood on a stone statue? Suddenly, he heard a soft thud. He turned around. The third statue, which had been facing the altar, was now tilted slightly toward him. Mark froze. He was sure it had been straight a minute ago. He walked closer, his flashlight trembling in his hand. The statue's stone eyes, which were supposed to be looking down, now seemed to be angled just a little higher, almost as if they were looking at his boots. Mark laughed nervously. "I'm just tired," he said loudly. His voice echoed uncomfortably against the stone walls. He decided to leave the chapel and go to the main house. He locked the heavy wooden door of the chapel and walked across the yard. When he reached the back door of his house, he looked back. The chapel was dark, but the moonlight hit the stained glass window. For a split second, Mark saw a shadow move inside. It was a tall, stiff shadow. It didn't move like a human. It moved like a heavy weight being dragged across the floor. Scrape, scrape, scrape. Mark rushed inside and locked every bolt on his door. He sat on his bed, staring at the window. He kept thinking about those stone eyes. Why did they look so hungry? He tried to sleep, but every time he closed his eyes, he heard that sound in his mind. Scrape, scrape. The sound of heavy stone moving on a stone floor. He didn't know it yet, but the inheritance his grandfather left him wasn't the house. It was the debt, and the saints were coming to collect the first payment. Mark did not sleep that night. Every time the wind blew against the old wooden house, he jumped. He felt like he was being watched, not by a person, but by something much older and much heavier. As the sun began to rise, the fear from the night before felt like a bad dream. It was just the shadows, he told himself, but his hands were still shaking as he made coffee. While exploring the dusty living room, Mark found an old, leather-bound diary tucked away in a secret compartment of his grandfather's desk. The pages were yellow and brittle. His grandfather's handwriting was messy, as if he had been writing in a great hurry or in great terror. Mark sat by the window and began to read. The first few pages were normal, talking about the farm and the weather. But as he turned the pages toward the end, the tone changed. One entry, dated exactly 10 years ago, made Mark's blood run cold. "They are not statues," the diary read. "We didn't carve them. We found them in the cave beneath the hill. My father thought they were a blessing, but they are a curse. They require a guest every 10 years to keep the village safe. If they are not fed with the sight of living eyes, they will wander the streets. I have locked them in the chapel, but the stone is growing skin. I can hear them breathing at night." Mark laughed nervously. "Feeding stone statues. This is crazy," he whispered. But then he remembered the metallic smell of blood on the stone book. He remembered the scrape, scrape sound. He continued reading. "If you hear the sound of grinding stone, do not look out the window. They move when you blink. They move when you turn your head. They are faster than you think. Whatever you do, Mark, Do not let them see you crying. They love the salt and human tears. Mark dropped the diary. How did his grandfather know his name would be in the diary? He hadn't seen his grandfather in 15 years. The diary felt heavy in his hands, almost like the stone in the chapel. Suddenly, a loud crack came from the backyard. Mark ran to the window. The chapel door, which he had locked with a heavy iron bolt the night before, was wide open. The wood around the lock was splintered, as if something incredibly strong had pushed it from the inside. He looked at the 3 pedestals inside the chapel through the open door. 2 statues were still there, standing tall and gray. But the 3rd pedestal, the one that held the saint with the stone book, was empty. Mark's heart hammered against his ribs. He scanned the yard. There was nothing but tall grass and old trees. Then, he looked down at the porch right below his window. There, sitting on the wooden steps, was the stone statue. It was sitting perfectly still, its stone book open on its lap. But it wasn't facing the yard anymore. It had its head turned at a sharp, unnatural angle, looking straight up at Mark's window. Its stone lips were curved into a tiny, frozen smile that wasn't there before. Mark backed away from the window, tripping over a chair. He realized with horror that the statue was now much closer to the house than it had been a few seconds ago. He hadn't heard it move. It was silent. He remembered the diary. They move when you blink. Mark tried to keep his eyes wide open. His vision started to blur. His eyes began to sting. He needed to blink. He held it for as long as he could, his eyes watering. Finally, he blinked. Thud. The sound came from right outside his bedroom door. It was the sound of a heavy, stone weight hitting the wooden floorboards. Scrape. Scrape. Something very heavy was now in the hallway, right outside his room. Mark grabbed a heavy lamp, his only weapon, and stared at the door handle. The handle began to turn, slowly, with the sound of grinding rock. Mark stood frozen as the door handle turned. The grinding sound of stone against metal was like teeth chattering in a cold room. He backed away until his heels hit the edge of the bed. The door creaked open, just an inch. A gray, stone finger, thick and cold, hooked around the edge of the wood. Mark didn't wait. He scrambled toward the small window on the opposite side of the room, shoved it open, and dropped onto the soft dirt of the garden below. He didn't look back. He ran toward the old tool shed near the basement entrance, his heart feeling like it was about to burst out of his chest. Inside the shed, he found a heavy iron crowbar. He needed to leave, but his car keys were still in the house. As he crouched in the shadows, he heard a voice. It wasn't a scream or a shout. It was a low, rhythmic humming coming from beneath the house, from the basement. "Grandfather," Mark whispered, though he knew his grandfather was dead. He followed the sound to the basement hatch. The wood was rotten and damp. He pulled it open, and a smell hit him, the smell of wet earth and something metallic. He climbed down the wooden ladder, his flashlight cutting through the thick darkness. The basement was larger than the house itself. It felt like a stone tomb. As Mark moved deeper, he saw something that made him stop breathing. In the corner of the basement, there were clothes. A pile of old shoes, a child's backpack, and a woman's purse. They were all covered in a fine, gray dust. Mark realized with a jolt of horror, these weren't his grandfather's things. These belonged to people who had gone missing in Oakhaven over the years. Suddenly, his flashlight flickered and died. In the pitch black, the humming stopped. Mark reached out his hand, touching the wall to find his way back. But the wall felt different. It wasn't flat stone. It was curved. It felt like a shoulder. A very large, very cold stone shoulder. Mark didn't breathe. He didn't move. He stood in the absolute darkness, inches away from something that shouldn't be alive. Then he heard it. A wet, heavy blink. Squish. "You're not supposed to be here," a voice whispered. It wasn't the statue. It was a man's voice, cracked and weak. Mark fumbled with his flashlight, hitting it against his palm until it clicked back on. The light revealed an old man sitting in a cage made of rusted iron bars in the corner. His skin was pale, almost gray, and his eyes were wide and bloodshot. "Who are you?" Mark gasped. "I was the guest 10 years ago," the man said, his voice trembling. "They didn't kill me. They kept me here to watch. They like to be watched while they eat. It makes the stone feel warm." The man pointed toward the shadows behind Mark. Mark slowly turned the flashlight. The 3 statues were no longer in the chapel. They were all here, in the basement, standing in a circle around him. But they were different now. Their stone skin was cracking. and through the cracks, Mark could see something red and pulsing. Their eyes were no longer looking at the floor. They were wide open, glowing with a dull, sickly yellow light. The middle saint, the one holding the book, stepped forward. Crunch! The stone floor beneath its feet shattered. It didn't move like a human. It moved like a machine made of rock, stiff and powerful. "They are hungry, Mark," the old man in the cage cried out. "And you are the new guest. The 10 years are up." Mark looked at the exit ladder, but the largest statue was already standing beneath it, its heavy stone arms reaching upward. Mark backed away from the ladder. The massive stone saint stood beneath the exit, its gray arms reaching up like frozen pillars. The basement was getting colder, and the air felt like it was filling with thick, heavy dust. Every time Mark breathed, his lungs felt like they were turning into lead. The old man in the cage began to laugh, a dry, rattling sound. "You can't run from them, Mark. They are the foundations of this town. Without their hunger, the very earth would swallow Oakhaven whole." The statue with the book stepped closer. Its stone face began to ripple. Mark watched in absolute terror as the gray rock on the statue's cheeks began to soften, turning into something that looked like pale, dead skin. One of its stone eyes twitched. A real, wet human eye was peering out from behind a crack in the stone. Mark felt a wave of nausea. These weren't just statues. They were something else, something ancient that used human bodies as a shell, coating them in living stone. "Stay back," Mark yelled, swinging the crowbar. He hit the arm of the nearest statue. A loud clang echoed through the basement, and the vibration nearly broke Mark's wrist. The statue didn't even flinch. It just looked down at the spot where he had hit it, and the crack in the stone healed instantly. In the middle of this nightmare, a strange, hollow voice filled the room. It didn't come from the statue's mouths, but from the walls themselves. The voice spoke a language that sounded like grinding rocks, but Mark understood the meaning perfectly. "The blood of the guardian has grown thin, and the stone demands a new heart." Mark realized the international line of this curse. Death is not the end of life. It is the beginning of the stone. This was the law of the saints. They didn't just kill, they transformed. They wanted to turn Mark into one of them, a silent, frozen watcher for the next 100 years. Suddenly, the statue with the book reached out. Its fingers were no longer stiff. They were moving like slow, heavy snakes. Mark scrambled toward the back of the basement, tripping over the pile of old clothes and bones. He felt something sharp under his hand, a small, silver key. "The key," the old man screamed from his cage. "The key to the chapel's heart. If you find the hidden altar, you can freeze them, or you can feed them." Mark gripped the key tight. He had to get out of this basement. He saw a small coal chute on the far wall. It was narrow, but he was thin. He dived toward it just as a heavy stone hand smashed into the floor where his head had been a second ago. If this story is making your blood run cold, make sure to subscribe to our channel right now and hit the like button. We bring you the most horrible and spine-chilling stories inspired by the dark legends of the world. Don't let the saints catch you. Join our community for more extreme horror every week. Mark crawled through the narrow coal chute, his skin peeling against the rough metal. Behind him, he heard the sound of the statues dragging themselves across the basement floor. Scrape, scrape, scrape. They were coming. He burst out into the night air, gasping for breath. The moon was blood red. He looked at his hands and screamed. Under his fingernails, his skin was starting to turn a dull, dusty gray. The transformation had already begun. He had the key, but he didn't know where the altar was. He looked toward the old chapel. It was glowing with a faint, sickly yellow light that Mark's legs felt like they were made of lead. Every step toward the chapel was a struggle. He looked at his arms in the moonlight. The gray color was spreading. It wasn't just dust. His skin was becoming hard, cold, and thick. The transformation was turning him into a living statue. He reached the chapel doors. The wood was cold, but when he touched it with the silver key, the door groaned and swung open on its own. The interior was no longer empty. The air was thick with the smell of incense and rotting meat. In the center of the chapel, where the statues used to stand, the floor had opened up. A spiral staircase made of bone-white stone led deep into the earth. Mark didn't want to go down, but he had no choice. The sound of scrape, scrape, scrape was getting closer from the house. The three saints were merging into the shadows of the yard, moving toward him like slow, unstoppable monsters. Mark ran down the stairs. At the bottom, he found a hidden chamber. The walls were covered in old photographs, thousands of them. They were all photos of people from the village, but their eyes had been cut out of the pictures. In the middle of the room sat a large, pulsing heart made of obsidian stone. It was hooked up to the walls by thick, red veins that looked like tree roots. "Grandfather," Mark gasped. At the base of the stone heart, he saw a figure. It was his grandfather, but he wasn't dead. He was fused into the wall. Half of his face was human, and the other half was cracked gray stone. His one remaining eye was wide and filled with tears. "Mark, you came," his grandfather whispered. His voice sounded like two rocks rubbing together. "I didn't die. I just became the foundation. Every 10 years, the heart needs a new guardian to hold the stone back. If I let go, the whole town turns to statues. The people, the children, everyone." Mark looked at the silver key in his hand. It wasn't a key to a door. It was a key to the heart. "I lied in the diary, Mark," the old man sobbed. "I didn't want to scare you away. I needed you to come. I can't hold the stone anymore. My heart is turning to dust. You have to take my place." Suddenly, the three statues appeared at the top of the stairs. They didn't walk down. They simply dropped, falling like heavy boulders and landing with a bone-shattering thud. They stood between Mark and the exit. Their stone faces were now completely human-like, but their expressions were filled with a terrible, eternal hunger. The one with the book opened it. The pages were no longer stone. They were made of dried human skin, and Mark's name was written on every single page in fresh, dripping blood. "The debt must be paid," the statues said in a voice that shook the ground. Mark looked at his grandfather, then at the stone heart, then at the monsters closing in. He realized the horrible truth. His grandfather hadn't left him a house or a life. He had lured his own grandson into a trap to save his own soul from the eternal weight of the stone. "No!" Mark screamed. He raised the silver key, ready to stab it into the pulsing stone heart. "Don't!" his grandfather shrieked. "If you break the heart, the curse explodes. The whole world will turn to stone." The largest statue reached out a hand. It was only inches away from Mark's face. He could smell the ancient, dry breath of the earth coming from its mouth. That Mark's hand trembled as he held the silver key above the pulsing stone heart. The three statues stopped moving. They stood like frozen giants in the flickering candlelight of the chamber. Their eyes, now fully human and wet with tears, stared at him with a mixture of hunger and pity. "You think you are the first to try and break the heart, Mark?" his grandfather whispered from the wall. His stone face cracked as he tried to smile. "Look around you. Look at the walls." Mark turned his flashlight toward the edges of the room. Behind the photographs, he saw them. Hundreds of bodies were pressed into the stone walls of the chamber. They weren't skeletons. They were preserved in gray, translucent rock. Men, women, and children. Their faces were locked in screams of eternal agony. "The village of Oakhaven isn't real, Mark," his grandfather groaned. "The people you saw on the street today, the baker, the postman, they are already stone. They only wake up when the sun is out because the heart allows them to move. At night, they return to their pedestals in their homes. If you stab that heart, they don't just die. They shatter into a million pieces of dust." Mark felt a cold wave of horror. He remembered the woman he saw waving at him earlier. Her skin had looked a bit too pale, her movements a bit too stiff. She wasn't a person. She was a puppet of this ancient, hungry stone. Suddenly, the largest statue, the one that had been the Saint of Mercy, stepped forward. Its stone skin began to peel away like old wallpaper. Underneath the rock was something that was definitely not human. It was a mass of writhing, black roots and glowing red veins. It had no face, only a vertical slit that opened to reveal rows of jagged stone teeth. "The shell is just a lie," the creature hissed. Its voice sounded like a mountain collapsing. "We are the earth. We are the weight that holds the world down. And we are very, very hungry." The creature reached out a long, root-like finger and touched Mark's chest. Mark tried to scream, but his throat felt like it was filled with dry sand. Where the creature touched him, his shirt turned to gray dust, and his skin hardened instantly. He couldn't move his arms. He couldn't drop the key. He was becoming a statue while he was still standing. "Mark, give in," his grandfather pleaded. "If you become the heart, you can at least keep your mind. If they take you by force, you will just be a shell." A hollow saint for people to pray to while you rot inside. Mark looked at the silver key. It was his only weapon, but he realized it wasn't meant to kill the heart. It was a needle. To save the village, he had to inject his own soul into the stone. Outside the chapel, he heard a terrifying sound. Thousands of feet were dragging across the grass. The people of Oakhaven were gathering outside. They were scratching at the chapel walls with their stone fingernails. They were hungry for the ritual to end so they could live for another 10 years. Please, a child's voice whispered from the stairs. Mark looked up. A small boy, about 7 years old, stood there. His legs were already solid rock. He couldn't walk. He was dragging himself with his hands. Please, don't let us shatter. It hurts to be dust. Mark's heart broke. He looked at the pulsing obsidian heart. He looked at the monsters waiting to consume him. He realized there was no escape. The saints had planned this for centuries. The small stone boy reached out a cold, gray hand toward Mark. Don't let us break, he whispered again. Mark felt a tear roll down his cheek, but it didn't fall. It turned into a tiny, salt crystal bead before it could hit the floor. The air in the chamber was now so thick with stone dust that every breath felt like swallowing glass. The three saints began to circle Mark and the pulsing obsidian heart. They weren't just statues anymore. Their stone shells were falling off in large chunks, revealing the writhing, black root monsters underneath. They were the ancient spirits of the earth, the things that lived in the dark before humans ever walked the ground. You think this is just about Oakhaven? The creature with the stone book hissed. It opened the book, and the pages of human skin began to glow. Oakhaven is just the seed. For 1,000 years, we have stayed in this small village, feeding on a few souls every decade. But the earth is tired of being beneath your feet. Mark looked at the book. The drawings on the skin pages were moving. He saw maps of great cities: London, New York, Tokyo. In the drawings, the buildings were cracking, and giant stone hands were reaching out from the foundations to grab the people on the streets. The ritual tonight isn't just to save the village, Mark, his grandfather groaned from the wall. His voice was almost gone, his mouth nearly sealed shut by gray rock. The heart, it's a battery. When you stab the silver key into it, you aren't just giving it your soul. You are giving it the human spark. That spark will let the stone spread. Once the heart is full, every statue in every museum, every stone in every building will wake up. Mark stared at the silver key. It was a bridge. If he used it to save the stone boy and the villagers, he would be the one who started the end of the world. If he didn't use it, the villagers would shatter into dust, but the saints would stay trapped in Oakhaven. Do it, the largest monster roared. It stepped toward the boy, its jagged stone teeth inches from the child's head. Feed the heart, or watch the child turn to powder right now. Mark looked at the boy's terrified, frozen eyes. He looked at the monsters. He felt the stone creeping up his own neck. He could no longer turn his head. His heart was the only thing left that felt warm. I won't let him break, Mark whispered. His voice was a rasping sound. He lunged forward, but he didn't stab the heart. He tried to stab the monster. The silver key hit the black roots, but it didn't cut them. Instead, the key was absorbed into the monster's body. The creature laughed, a sound like a landslide. Thank you, Mark, the monster said. The key needed to be offered by a willing human. Now, the seal is broken. The obsidian heart began to beat faster. Thump thump, thump thump. The red veins on the walls began to glow like hot lava. Outside, the scratching sound of the villagers stopped. It was replaced by a terrifying, unified scream that echoed across the entire valley. The stone boy's eyes turned bright red. He wasn't a victim anymore. He stood up, his stone legs moving with terrifying strength. He looked at Mark and smiled, revealing rows of sharp stone needles for teeth. It's time for the world to go to sleep, the boy said. Mark fell to his knees. He could feel his heartbeat slowing down. He could feel his thoughts becoming heavy and slow. He was losing his mind to the stone. But just before his eyes turned to rock, he saw the monsters merging together into one giant, towering pillar of flesh and stone that punched through the ceiling of the chapel, rising high into the night sky. Mark's vision was narrowing. The gray stone had reached his jaw, locking his mouth into a permanent, silent gasp. He couldn't move his arms, and his legs were now part of the chapel floor. The giant pillar of flesh and rock continued to grow, screaming into the night sky, sending ripples of dark energy across the earth. Suddenly, the world went silent. The monsters vanished. The red glow faded. The screaming of the villagers stopped. Mark found himself still standing in the basement chamber, but everything was different. The stone heart was gone. His grandfather was gone. Even the little boy had disappeared. For a moment, Mark felt a surge of hope. Did I stop it? He thought. He tried to move his hand. It moved. He tried to blink. He could blink. His skin looked normal again. He was human. He ran up the spiral stairs and burst out of the chapel doors. It was a beautiful, sunny morning in Oakhaven. The birds were singing, and the air smelled like fresh flowers. He saw the baker setting out bread. He saw the postman walking down the street. Everyone looked happy. I did it, Mark shouted. I broke the curse. The baker looked up and smiled at him. Good morning, Mark. Beautiful day to be alive, isn't it? Mark laughed, tears of joy running down his face. He walked toward the village square, wanting to tell everyone they were safe. But then he stopped. He noticed something strange. A young woman was sitting on a bench, reading a book. She didn't turn the page. She didn't move her eyes. She didn't even breathe. Mark walked closer and touched her shoulder. His hand went right through her. She wasn't a person. She was a hologram, a projection of light. Mark looked at the baker. The baker was still smiling, but his eyes were fixed on a point in space. He wasn't real either. Mark ran to the postman and tried to grab his arm. His hand passed through the postman like he was touching smoke. Then, Mark looked down at his own feet. He wasn't standing on the grass. He was standing on a white marble pedestal. In front of him, there was a large glass wall. Beyond the glass, he saw a giant, modern hall. It looked like a museum larger than any city. Groups of strange, tall creatures with skin like polished obsidian were walking past the glass. They were wearing clothes made of light, and they were pointing at him. One of the creatures tapped on the glass and smiled at its child. Mark looked at the small sign at the base of his pedestal. It was written in a language he couldn't read, but the date was clear, October 12th, 3026. The saints hadn't just taken Oakhaven. They had taken the whole world 1,000 years ago. Mark wasn't a hero who saved the village. He was a digital ghost, a recorded memory of the last human soul, kept in a simulated loop inside a stone gallery for the amusement of the new rulers of Earth. The saints were the statues, and the statues were now the masters. Every 10 years, the simulation reset to give the new saints a fresh show. The horror Mark felt wasn't real. It was a programmed emotion. As the sun began to set in his fake world, Mark felt the stone creeping up his neck again. He saw the little stone boy from the basement standing at the edge of his vision. The boy wasn't a projection. He was one of the masters. He leaned against the glass and whispered into the simulation. Don't worry, Mark. We'll play again in 10 years. You're our favorite piece of art. Mark's eyes turned to stone one last time, locked in an eternal scream of realization as the museum lights dimmed for the night. If this twist ending chilled you to the bone, make sure to like this video and share it with your friends. Do you have a terrifying story or a real-life horror encounter of your own? Tell us about it in the comments below. I will be pinning the most horrible and spine-chilling story to the top of the comment section. Don't be shy, the saints are listening.